On November 29, 2020, police responded to a 911 call from a quiet residential neighborhood in Farmington, New Mexico. The call came from a woman who sounded shaken, struggling to breathe between her words. She told the dispatcher her husband was dead. When officers arrived at the home, they found 47-year-old Heather waiting outside. Her face was pale, her hands trembled, and her voice cracked as she tried to explain what had happened. She led officers inside, down a hallway, into a bedroom, and there, on the floor, lay her husband, 49-year-old Robert. He was cold to the touch, unresponsive, and covered in injuries that immediately made the situation feel wrong. At first, it looked like a tragic medical emergency. Something sudden, something unexpected. But within minutes, officers realized this was something else entirely. Heather told police she had fallen asleep on the couch earlier that night. When she woke up and walked into the bedroom, she found Robert lying on the floor. She said he had complained about pain earlier. Chest pain, discomfort, but she hadn't believed it was serious. Then officers noticed the wounds. Multiple marks across Robert's chest. Some looked like cuts, others deeper. Heather tried to explain. She said Robert may have hurt himself, maybe with a razor, maybe with a steak knife. She wasn't sure. Her story shifted as she spoke, as if she was trying to remember something she couldn't fully piece together. Paramedics examined the body. Officers looked around the room. Something didn't feel right. The injuries didn't appear deep enough to instantly kill someone. There was less blood than expected, and the timeline Heather described felt unclear. Detectives were called to the scene. As investigators took a closer look at Robert's body, they made a discovery that changed everything. Some of the wounds weren't scratches. They weren't shallow cuts. They were punctures. Precise, intentional, forceful. This was no longer a routine death. This was now a possible homicide. Inside the home, more people began emerging from different rooms. Heather's adult son, Tyler, had been staying there. So had his girlfriend, Elizabeth, and their children. All of them claimed they heard nothing during the night. No shouting, no struggle, no noise. Everyone was escorted to the station for questioning. Detectives needed to understand exactly what had happened inside that house. Heather began recounting the evening. She said she and Robert had spent time together at home. He played video games. They talked casually. They had drinks. At one point, she warmed up a slice of pie for him. It sounded normal, ordinary. Later, she said Robert began complaining about chest pain again. He looked uncomfortable, possibly intoxicated. She helped him into bed. Then she went back to the couch and fell asleep. Hours later, she returned to the bedroom, and that's when she saw blood. Heather claimed Robert told her he had used a steak knife on himself. She said she cleaned the wounds, believing they weren't serious, believing he would be okay. Investigators immediately struggled with that explanation. If someone you love tells you they stabbed themselves, why wouldn't you call 911 immediately? Why clean the injuries first? Why leave him alone? The inconsistencies started piling up. Heather first said she didn't know what caused the wounds. Later, she said Robert admitted using a knife. She changed the timeline of when she found him. Her description of the bleeding didn't match what detectives expected. And then came another major discovery. The knife believed to be involved was located back in the kitchen, in the knife block. Clean. As if nothing had happened. No visible blood. No panic. No urgency. Detectives began questioning everything. Tyler, Heather's son, described his mother as caring, but emotionally intense. He admitted the family had been drinking that night, possibly more than Heather had told police. He also revealed something troubling. There had been tension in the home before. Arguments, emotional moments, stress, and recently, during an argument, Heather had hit him. Investigators pressed further. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices early that morning. Not violent screaming, but loud enough to notice. Heather, however, insisted there had been no argument, no conflict, no confrontation. As interviews continued, the timeline became even more complicated. Heather said she discovered Robert around 5 a.m., but another person in the house recalled hearing her crying earlier, before the 911 call was placed. So detectives asked, why the delay? Why clean the wounds first? Why move around the house before calling for help? Investigators also focused on Robert's condition earlier in the night. He had complained of pain. He appeared disoriented, possibly intoxicated. Yet no medical help was called. Not once. Every answer Heather gave only created more questions. Detectives eventually confronted her directly. Why didn't you stay with him? Why didn't you call 911 immediately? Why clean the blood? Why was the knife back in place? Why didn't anyone hear anything? Heather broke down. She cried. She shook. She said she failed him. She said she didn't understand how serious it was. She said she thought he would be okay. But by this point, investigators were no longer looking at a tragic misunderstanding. They were trying to determine something much darker. Was this self-inflicted? Was it an accident? Or had something happened inside that home that someone was trying to hide? The physical evidence didn't tell a simple story. The wounds were unusual. The scene felt inconsistent. The timeline didn't align. And the emotional reactions inside the home varied from person to person. Some seemed shocked, others distant. As detectives continued digging, they reconstructed the final hours of Robert's life. What he ate, what he drank, where he walked, who he spoke to. Piece by piece, they tried to understand what led to that moment on the bedroom floor. But the deeper they looked, the more complicated it became. There was no clear motive, no obvious struggle, no witnesses, only fragments, statements, emotions, and evidence that didn't fully connect. The case moved from confusion to suspicion, from suspicion to serious investigation, and eventually toward potential criminal charges. But one question still hovered over everything. What really happened inside that house that night? Was it a tragic medical event misunderstood in the moment? A panic-driven mistake? An argument that spiraled out of control? Or something intentional, hidden beneath fear and confusion? Investigators knew one thing for certain. The truth wasn't simple, and it wasn't obvious. Because sometimes, the most disturbing cases don't begin with violence. They begin with small decisions, moments of hesitation, silence where there should have been urgency, and stories that don't quite line up. Robert's death left behind more than grief. It left behind uncertainty, questions without answers, and a night that, piece by piece, investigators would spend months trying to reconstruct. But even with evidence, even with interviews, even with pressure mounting, the truth remained just out of reach. Because sometimes the hardest cases to solve are the ones that happen behind closed doors, where only a few people know what really happened, and not all of them are ready to tell the story. And sometimes, the difference between accident and crime comes down to what happened in just a few minutes no one else